Hey there. Tonight we're walking the dusty caravan paths of ancient ambition. Not the romantic merchant highway of legend, but the harsh reality beneath the silk banners. Just a story of failed diplomacy, 10 years of captivity, and the discovery that the world was infinitely larger than any empire had imagined. If you find peace in these forgotten journeys, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about where you're tuning in from. There's something wonderful about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, finding connection through these ancient stories. So dim the lights. Let's begin with a Chinese general who thought he was going to war, but discovered something that would connect civilizations for 1,000 years. Chapter 1. Origins of the Silk Road. Trade, Diplomacy, and Discovery. The Silk Road did not begin with a single road, or even with silk. It began with footsteps, with caravans, with small exchanges of salt, jade, and grain across windswept plains. It began with human curiosity about what lay beyond the next horizon, and with the patient understanding that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from achieving our original goals, but from remaining open to possibilities we never imagined. In the ancient city of Balkh, in what we now call Afghanistan, the year 119 before the Common Era, the air shimmered with heat and dust from countless caravans. The marketplace buzzed with the sounds of a dozen languages, Greek merchants arguing over prices and the accents of distant Macedonia, Persian administrators discussing tax collection in the formal tones of imperial bureaucracy, local Bactrian traders calling out their wares in voices weathered by desert winds. The scents were equally complex, cardamom and cinnamon from Indian traders, the sharp tang of fermented mare's milk carried by nomadic visitors, the sweet smoke of sandalwood burning at a small Buddhist shrine tucked between merchant stalls. Zhang Qian moved through this sensory maze like a man walking through a dream. 10 years of captivity among the Xiongnu had changed him profoundly. His once pristine Han military uniform had long since been replaced by practical steppe clothing, felt boots that could withstand freezing winters, a long coat of sheep's wool dyed in the bright blues favored by nomadic peoples, a leather belt studded with silver ornaments in patterns he had learned to appreciate during his years of exile. His hair, now longer than any Chinese court official would permit, was braided in a style that marked him as a man who had lived between worlds. But it was not his appearance that had changed most dramatically. Zhang Qian's eyes now held the patient wisdom of someone who had learned to see beyond the boundaries of his birth culture. The arrogance of imperial certainty had been worn away by years of dependence on the kindness of strangers, replaced by curiosity about the infinite variety of human adaptation to different landscapes and challenges. As he paused before a merchant's stall displaying fine textiles, something caught his attention that made his breath stop entirely. Draped across a wooden frame catching the afternoon sunlight like captured fire, hung a bolt of silk fabric that he recognized as unmistakably Chinese. Not just any silk, but silk woven in the specific pattern favored by the imperial workshops of Chang'an, a complex design of interlocking dragons that required months of skilled labor to complete. Zhang Qian reached out with trembling fingers to touch the fabric. The silk was genuine, its texture as familiar to him as his own skin. He had seen this very pattern adorning the robes of court officials in the Forbidden City. Yet here it was, thousands of miles from China, in a marketplace where no Chinese merchant had ever officially traveled. The Bactrian textile seller, a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and hands stained by years of handling dyes, watched Zhang Qian's reaction with professional interest. Through gestures and the few words of broken Persian and Greek that Zhang Qian had acquired during his captivity, he managed to communicate his astonishment. Where had this silk originated? How had it traveled so far from its homeland? The merchant's explanation, pieced together through halting conversation and careful pantomime, revealed something that would change Zhang Qian's understanding of the world forever. The silk had not come directly from China. Instead, it had passed through many hands across many lands. The merchant's fingers walked across an imaginary map as he spoke. Each exchange had added to its value, each trader taking profit while passing the precious fabric further west. Chinese merchants had sold it to Central Asian intermediaries, who had traded it to Persian dealers, who had eventually brought it to this distant marketplace where Greek silver could purchase the products of Chinese workshops. In that moment, Zhang Qian realized that his failed diplomatic mission had accidentally uncovered something far more valuable than any military alliance. He had discovered proof of humanity's irrepressible desire to connect across vast distances, to share beauty and luxury, and the products of skilled craftsmanship, to build bridges of commerce that could span continents and connect civilizations that had never heard of each other's existence. This discovery in a dusty marketplace would eventually give birth to the most famous trade network in human history. But to understand how Zhang Qian came to be standing in that Bactrian bazaar, we must return to the imperial capital of Chang'an, where an ambitious emperor's impossible dream had set these world-changing events in motion. The Han imperial palace at Chang'an rose like a vision of heaven made manifest in wood, stone, and brilliant lacquered timber. In the year 140 before the Common Era, Emperor Wu held court in halls where every surface spoke of the power and sophistication of Chinese civilization. Massive wooden pillars, painted in imperial yellow and decorated with dragons that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of oil lamps, supported roofs that curved skyward like the wings of mystical birds. The floors were paved with polished stone so smooth it reflected the silk robes of courtiers like a dark mirror. The emperor himself was a figure of imposing presence, still young but already marked by the weight of ruling the most populous empire on earth. His robes were woven from silk so fine it seemed to shimmer with inner light, deep imperial yellow adorned with golden dragons that caught and held the glow of hundreds of bronze lamps. When he moved, the silk whispered secrets of luxury that only the most skilled weavers could create. But on this particular morning, Emperor Wu's attention was focused not on displays of wealth and power, but on a problem that gnawed at the security of his realm. Spread across a low table before him were reports from his northern frontier, accounts of Xiongnu raids that had grown bolder and more devastating with each passing season. These nomadic confederations, masters of mounted warfare, struck Chinese settlements like lightning and vanished back into the vast steppes before imperial armies could respond. The emperor's advisors clustered around the table, their voices creating a low murmur of concern and frustration. General after general had attempted to solve the Xiongnu problem through military force, but the nomads' mobility made them nearly impossible to defeat in conventional battle. They appeared suddenly at the edges of Chinese territory, struck with devastating efficiency, and melted away into landscapes where Chinese infantry could not follow and Chinese supply lines could not reach. It was during one of these strategy sessions that a junior military officer brought news that would change the course of history. A group of Xiongnu prisoners, captured during a recent border skirmish, had revealed information about peoples and kingdoms far beyond the northern steppes. Under interrogation, they spoke of a great confederation called the Yuezhi. These people had once been powerful neighbors of the Xiongnu, controlling vast territories and commanding respect among the nomadic tribes. But warfare and politics had driven them westward, like leaves scattered by autumn winds. The Yuezhi had settled in distant lands beyond the Great Desert, the prisoners claimed. There, in valleys where they had built new homes and planted new crops, they nursed grievances against their former enemies. They might welcome Chinese alliance against their mutual foes. Emperor Wu's eyes brightened as he listened to this intelligence. Here, perhaps, was the answer to his strategic dilemma. If the Yuezhi could be persuaded to join forces with China, the Xiongnu would face enemies on two fronts. Caught between Chinese armies advancing from the east and Yuezhi forces striking from the west, the nomadic confederation might finally be crushed. But reaching the Yuezhi would require a journey of unprecedented difficulty and danger. The route led through Xiongnu territory, across deserts that had swallowed entire armies, over mountains where the air grew thin enough to stop a man's breath. It was a mission that combined diplomacy with exploration, requiring someone brave enough to face unknown dangers and skilled enough to negotiate with peoples whose languages, customs, and motivations were complete mysteries. The emperor's gaze fell upon Zhang Qian, a young general whose military record showed both courage and intelligence. Zhang Qian had distinguished himself in frontier campaigns, demonstrating not only personal bravery, but also the kind of adaptability that might serve him well in unknown territories. More importantly, he possessed the diplomatic skills necessary for delicate negotiations, and the curiosity about foreign peoples that could transform military intelligence into genuine understanding. Zhang Qian accepted the mission with the confidence of youth and the loyalty of a professional soldier. He understood the risks. Xiongnu territory stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, and any Chinese expedition would be viewed as a military threat. But he also understood the potential rewards. Success could bring not only military alliance but also invaluable knowledge about the Western regions, their peoples, resources, and strategic importance. The preparation for Zhang Qian's expedition reflected both the mission's importance and its uncertainty. Imperial workshops created maps based on interrogations of prisoners and the fragmentary knowledge of border traders. The cartographers worked with brush and ink, sketching mountain ranges that might exist, rivers that could be myths, cities that lived only in travelers, tales. Craftsmen prepared gifts suitable for unknown rulers, bolts of finest silk, woven in patterns that told stories of dragons and phoenixes, jade ornaments carved by master artisans whose families had perfected their skills across generations, bronze mirrors polished to such brilliance they seemed to hold pieces of sky, lacquered boxes inlaid with mother-of-pearl that gleamed like captured moonlight. These items represented the pinnacle of Chinese craftsmanship, designed to demonstrate the wealth and sophistication that potential allies might share. Zhang Qian's expedition was deliberately kept small to avoid appearing threatening to the peoples they would encounter. Just over 100 men accompanied him, soldiers skilled in mounted warfare, interpreters who spoke the languages of neighboring peoples, craftsmen who could maintain equipment and create gifts, and servants who could manage the practical details of a journey that might last for years. The departure from Chang'an took place with ceremonies that befitted an imperial mission, but also carried undertones of farewell that might prove permanent. Buddhist monks burned incense and chanted prayers for safe travel. Confucian scholars offered quotations from ancient texts about the importance of extending Chinese civilization to barbarian lands. Court musicians played melodies that would echo in Zhang Qian's memory during the long months ahead. As the small expedition rode westward through the gates of Chang'an, Zhang Qian carried with him not only the emperor's formal instructions, but also the hopes and fears of an entire civilization. He was venturing into the unknown, not as an explorer driven by personal curiosity, but as the representative of a people who believed their culture represented the highest achievement of human civilization. What Zhang Qian could not have known as the familiar landmarks of Chinese territory fell behind him was that his journey would teach him lessons that no amount of court education could provide. He would learn that the world beyond China's borders was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. He would discover that other peoples possessed their own forms of sophistication, their own solutions to the challenges of creating prosperous societies, their own contributions to the great human conversation about how best to live. The first stage of Zhang Qian's journey led through the contested borderlands, where Chinese farming communities gave way to the nomadic territories of the Xiongnu. Here, the landscape itself told the story of two different approaches to human survival. Chinese settlements clustered around water sources, their fields laid out in neat geometric patterns that spoke of centuries of agricultural refinement. Irrigation canals carried precious water to crops of millet and wheat, while mulberry orchards provided leaves for these silkworms whose cocoons would become the empire's most valuable export. But as the expedition moved further west, cultivated fields gave way to grasslands that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. This was nomadic territory, where survival depended not on controlling specific pieces of land, but on understanding the seasonal rhythms that governed the movement of herds. The Xiongnu had mastered this environment so completely that they could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating efficiency, and vanish back into landscapes that seemed empty but held all the resources they needed. It was in this borderland region that Zhang Qian's expedition encountered its first major challenge. Xiongnu scouts, mounted on horses so swift they seemed to skim across the grassland like birds, had been shadowing the Chinese force for days. These nomadic warriors possessed a mobility that Chinese infantry could not match, and a knowledge of local terrain that gave them every advantage. The attack, when it came, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had made the Xiongnu the terror of the northern frontier. They struck at dawn, emerging from morning mist like supernatural beings. Their composite bows, crafted from horn and sinew, could drive arrows through Chinese armor at distances that made retaliation impossible. Their horses, bred for speed and endurance, carried them in swooping attacks that struck the Chinese column from multiple directions simultaneously. Zhang Qian's men, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves helpless against nomadic tactics. They formed defensive squares and prepared for charges that never came. They attempted to pursue enemies who vanished into grasslands like smoke dissolving in wind. Within hours, the expedition was surrounded and overwhelmed by forces that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. The capture itself was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the chase. Zhang Qian, his men scattered or killed, found himself face to face with Xiongnu warriors, whose appearance was as foreign as their tactics. These men wore clothing adapted to life on horseback, long coats that could serve as blankets, felt caps that protected against sun and wind, boots designed for stirrups rather than marching. Their weapons showed the practical elegance of nomadic craftsmanship, curved sabers perfect for mounted combat, composite bows that could be drawn and fired from horseback, spears designed for the thrust and retreat tactics of mounted warfare. But perhaps most striking was their demeanor. These were not the savage barbarians of Chinese imagination, but skilled professionals who had mastered one of the most demanding environments on earth. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who understood their world completely, who had developed technologies and social systems perfectly adapted to their chosen way of life. Zhang Qian's first months in captivity were a profound education in humility. Everything he had learned about proper behavior, appropriate relationships, and civilized living proved useless in nomadic society. The Xiongnu measured worth not by scholarly achievement or bureaucratic rank, but by practical skills that contributed to group survival. They valued horsemanship above calligraphy, knowledge of weather patterns above familiarity with classical texts, the ability to read animal behavior above the capacity to compose poetry. Yet gradually, Zhang Qian began to understand that this was not a lack of civilization, but a different form of it. Xiongnu society possessed its own complexities, its own forms of art and learning, its own solutions to the eternal human challenges of creating order and meaning. Their music, performed around campfires under star-filled skies, told stories of heroes and journeys that resonated with universal human themes. Their craftsmen created objects of genuine beauty, silver ornaments that caught moonlight like captured stars, felt carpets dyed in colors that rivaled Chinese silk, leather goods decorated with patterns that told the stories of their makers, clans, and achievements. Most importantly, Zhang Qian learned the Xiongnu languages and customs well enough to function as a member of their society. This was not merely a matter of survival, but of genuine adaptation. He married a Xiongnu woman, learned to love the children born of that union, and discovered that human affection and family loyalty transcended the boundaries of ethnicity and culture. During the long winters, when nomadic camps settled into sheltered valleys, Zhang Qian listened to stories told by travelers who had journeyed far beyond Xiongnu territory. Merchants spoke of oasis cities, where multiple peoples traded goods from across the known world. Diplomats described kingdoms ruled by descendants of Alexander's generals, where Greek architectural styles blended with local traditions to create something entirely new. Pilgrims told of Buddhist monasteries where Chinese monks studied alongside scholars from India and Central Asia. These conversations planted seeds of understanding that would later blossom into Zhang Qian's revolutionary insights about the possibilities for peaceful exchange between distant civilizations. He began to realize that the world beyond China's borders was not empty wilderness populated by barbarians, but a complex network of peoples and cultures, each with their own achievements and their own contributions to make to human knowledge and prosperity. After 10 years of this unexpected education, Zhang Qian faced the decision that would define the rest of his life and alter the course of world history. He could remain among the Xiongnu, where he had found a place in a family and a form of security. Or he could attempt to complete his original mission, knowing that success was unlikely and that failure might mean death for himself and anyone who accompanied him. The decision to escape came not from duty alone, but from a growing vision of what might be possible if the peoples of Eurasia could find ways to connect peacefully rather than through conquest and conflict. Zhang Qian had learned that the Xiongnu possessed goods and skills that would be valuable in China, just as Chinese products and technologies might benefit nomadic peoples. He had heard descriptions of Western kingdoms that suggested opportunities for trade and cultural exchange that could benefit everyone involved. The escape itself required careful planning and considerable luck. Zhang Qian used his knowledge of nomadic seasonal patterns to time his departure for a period when Xiongnu attention would be focused on moving herds to new pastures. He took with him a small group of companions, Chinese soldiers who had survived the original capture, Xiongnu friends who had come to share his vision of broader possibilities, and his own family, whose presence would provide both motivation for success and devastating consequences for failure. The journey westward from Xiongnu territory led through landscapes that challenged every assumption about what constituted habitable land. They crossed deserts where the silence was so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums, where sand dunes shifted like frozen waves under stars so bright they cast shadows, where survival depended on finding water sources that might be separated by days of travel through emptiness that stretched to every horizon. Yet even these forbidding landscapes supported human life for those who understood their rhythms and possibilities. Oasis settlements appeared like miracles of green abundance amid oceanic expanses of sand and stone. These communities had developed technologies and social systems adapted to their unique environment, irrigation networks that brought underground water to the surface, agricultural techniques that maximized productivity from limited fertile soil, trading relationships that connected them to distant markets and provided access to goods they could not produce locally. It was in these oasis communities that Zhang Qian first glimpsed the reality of the trade networks that he would later help to organize and expand. Merchants from many different peoples gathered in these settlements, creating temporary communities bound together by commercial interest rather than ethnic loyalty. Chinese silk traveled alongside Indian spices. Persian carpets were traded for Central Asian horses. Roman glassware was exchanged for nomadic felt goods. The languages spoken in these marketplaces reflected the diversity of the peoples who gathered there. Zhang Qian heard Greek spoken by descendants of Alexander's soldiers who had settled in distant kingdoms, Persian used by administrators of the great empire that stretched from the Levant to the Indus River, Sanskrit chanted by Buddhist monks carrying sacred texts between monasteries, and local languages that had developed through centuries of contact between different peoples. But it was in Bactria, the prosperous kingdom that controlled much of what is now Afghanistan, that Zhang Qian made the discovery that would transform his understanding of the possibilities for peaceful exchange between civilizations. The Bactrian capital was a cosmopolitan city where Greek architectural styles blended with Persian administrative systems and Indian artistic influences. Its markets displayed goods from across the known world, creating a feast for the senses that demonstrated the wealth that could flow from successful commercial relationships. And there, in that bustling marketplace where we first encountered him, Zhang Qian found Chinese silk being sold by merchants who had never seen China, and purchased by customers who had never heard of the Han Emperor. The silk had traveled thousands of miles, through the hands of dozens of intermediaries, each of whom had profited from its passage, while adding to its value through their knowledge of local markets and preferences. This discovery revolutionized Zhang Qian's understanding of his mission and its possibilities. He had been sent to find military allies for a war against the Xiongnu. Instead, he had discovered evidence of commercial networks that could benefit everyone involved without requiring conquest or conflict. The peoples of the western regions possessed goods and skills that would be valuable in China, while Chinese products clearly found eager markets in distant lands. Zhang Qian's conversations with Bactrian merchants and officials revealed that the Weiji had indeed settled in the region, but their circumstances had changed dramatically since their displacement by the Yongnu. They had established prosperous kingdoms in the fertile valleys south of the Oxus River, where they had adapted to settled agricultural life and developed trading relationships with their new neighbors. The idea of returning east to fight ancient enemies held little appeal for people who had found security and prosperity in their new homeland. This meant that Zhang Qian's original diplomatic mission had failed completely. He would return to China without the military alliance that Emperor Wu had sought, without the strategic advantage that was supposed to solve the Xiongnu problem, without any of the specific objectives that had justified his dangerous journey. Yet Zhang Qian understood that he was returning with something potentially more valuable than military allies. He carried detailed intelligence about dozens of kingdoms and peoples that had previously been mere names or rumors. He possessed first-hand knowledge of trade goods, agricultural techniques, military technologies, and diplomatic practices that could benefit Chinese civilization in countless ways. Most importantly, he had developed a vision of peaceful exchange that could create prosperity for everyone involved, rather than requiring the defeat and subjugation of foreign peoples. The return journey to Chang'an tested every survival skill that Zhang Qian had acquired during his years of involuntary education. The route led through territories controlled by peoples who viewed any armed group with suspicion, across deserts where water sources were guarded secrets, over mountain passes where altitude and weather could kill the unprepared. Yet Zhang Qian's expedition had advantages that the original mission had lacked. They now understood nomadic customs well enough to negotiate safe passage through tribal territories. They carried goods valuable enough to trade for supplies and information. Most importantly, they possessed the knowledge necessary to avoid the mistakes that had led to their original capture. When Zhang Qian finally reached Chinese territory after 13 years of absence, he found a world that had changed significantly during his involuntary exile. Emperor Wu's campaigns against the Xiongnu had achieved mixed results at enormous cost, demonstrating the limitations of purely military solutions to nomadic challenges. Border communities had developed their own relationships with nomadic peoples, creating informal networks of trade and communication that existed despite official policies of hostility. Zhang Qian's return created a sensation at the imperial court. Courtiers gathered to hear descriptions of distant lands and peoples that had previously existed only in imagination. Scholars took careful notes as Zhang Qian described the governments, technologies, and customs of more than 30 different kingdoms. His military advisors studied his accounts of foreign armies, their weapons, tactics, and strategic capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, Emperor Wu himself began to understand the implications of Zhang Qian's discoveries for Chinese strategy and prosperity. The detailed intelligence that Zhang Qian provided revealed opportunities for expanding Chinese influence through trade and diplomacy rather than conquest and military occupation. The goods that Zhang Qian had observed in Western markets could provide new sources of imperial revenue, while the technologies and techniques he had learned could benefit Chinese agriculture, craftsmanship, and military capabilities. The emperor's response to Zhang Qian's reports marked a fundamental shift in Chinese thinking about the Western regions and their peoples. Rather than viewing these areas purely as military problems to be solved through conquest, imperial policy began to recognize them as potential partners in mutually beneficial relationships. This did not eliminate military considerations entirely, but it opened new possibilities for achieving Chinese objectives through peaceful means. Zhang Qian's second mission, launched in 115 before the Common Era, reflected these new insights and priorities. This time he traveled with 300 men and thousands of cattle and sheep to trade, demonstrating Chinese wealth and establishing the kinds of reciprocal relationships that could benefit everyone involved. His instructions emphasized establishing friendly relationships with as many Western peoples as possible, opening markets, and gathering intelligence about commercial opportunities, rather than focusing solely on military alliances. This second journey proved far more successful than the first, precisely because its objectives were more realistic and its methods more appropriate to the actual conditions Zhang Qian encountered. He and his lieutenants made contact with dozens of communities, establishing the personal relationships and mutual trust that would undergird decades of subsequent trade. They demonstrated Chinese products and technologies while learning about Western innovations that could benefit Chinese civilization. The consequences of these diplomatic and commercial contacts rippled outward in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Chinese demand for Central Asian horses led to the development of specialized breeding programs and trading networks. The westward flow of Chinese silk created new sources of wealth for intermediary merchants and transformed social customs in distant kingdoms. Knowledge of Chinese agricultural techniques increased food production in oasis communities, while Western innovations in metallurgy and glassmaking found eager audiences in Chinese workshops. Perhaps most importantly, Zhang Qian's missions established precedents for cultural tolerance and mutual respect that would characterize Silk Road relationships for centuries to come. Successful merchants needed to understand and accommodate different languages, religions, and customs. They had to develop appreciation for foreign aesthetics, respect for local laws and traditions, and skills in cross-cultural communication. This practical necessity for adaptability gradually created communities along the trade routes that were remarkably cosmopolitan for their time. The infrastructure necessary to support these growing commercial relationships developed gradually through the cooperation of many different peoples and governments. The Chinese established military garrisons and supply stations at strategic points along the routes, but these served primarily to protect merchants and facilitate trade rather than to control territory or suppress local populations. Oasis communities invested in improved irrigation systems, larger markets, and better accommodations for traveling merchants. Nomadic peoples developed specialized services for caravan protection and livestock supply. The Dunhuang garrison, established around 111 before the Common Era, exemplified the transformation that Zhang Qian's discoveries had initiated. Originally conceived as a military outpost to protect Chinese territory from nomadic raids, it evolved into a crucial staging point where merchants from many different peoples could rest, resupply, and gather information about conditions further along their routes. The soldiers stationed there protected more than Chinese territory. They safeguarded the growing stream of commerce that flowed in both directions across the desert. By the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, what had begun as Zhang Qian's failed diplomatic mission had evolved into something unprecedented in human history. A continent-spanning network of commercial, diplomatic, and cultural exchange connected the major civilizations of Eurasia, allowing goods, ideas, and technologies to flow between peoples who had previously existed in isolation from each other. Chinese silk was being worn by Roman senators who had never heard of the Han Emperor. Central Asian musicians were performing in Chinese courts, their melodies blending local traditions with foreign influences to create new forms of artistic expression. Persian craftsmen were learning Chinese techniques for working with jade and lacquer, while Chinese artisans were experimenting with Western methods of glassmaking and carpet weaving. The network's organic growth meant that no single authority controlled it, but this apparent weakness proved to be a source of remarkable strength. The Silk Road could adapt to changing political conditions, route around conflicts and obstacles, and incorporate new participants without requiring approval from any central government. It had become, in a sense, larger than any of the empires it connected, creating relationships and dependencies that transcended political boundaries and ethnic loyalties. The success of these early trade relationships also demonstrated something profound about human nature and the possibilities for peaceful cooperation between different peoples. Zhang Qian had discovered that the fundamental human desires for security, prosperity, and connection could bridge enormous differences in language, religion, and culture. People who shared no common heritage could still recognize mutual benefits in cooperation and exchange. The technologies that developed to support long-distance trade reflected this spirit of practical cooperation. Merchants created standardized weights and measures that allowed fair comparisons of value across different markets. They developed letters of credit that could be honored by commercial partners separated by thousands of miles, reducing the need to transport precious metals across dangerous terrain. They established insurance arrangements that shared the risks of long-distance trade among multiple participants, making ventures possible that would have been too dangerous for individual traders. The linguistic innovations necessary for cross-cultural commerce created new forms of communication that transcended ethnic boundaries. Trade languages emerged that combined elements from multiple sources, allowing people with no common background to negotiate complex agreements and build lasting relationships. Translation services developed that could bridge not only linguistic differences, but also cultural gaps in understanding about everything from commercial practices to religious customs. Perhaps most remarkably, the early Silk Road demonstrated that commercial relationships could coexist with political conflicts without being destroyed by them. Chinese and Zhongnu merchants traded peacefully in Central Asian markets, even while their governments remained officially at war. Persian and Roman goods traveled the same routes despite the military rivalries between their empires. Buddhist and Zoroastrian merchants collaborated successfully despite theological differences that divided their religious communities. As evening settles over this tale of accidental discovery and gradual connection, we might reflect on Zhang Qian's own words, recorded by the Chinese historian Sima Qian decades after the general's death. Asked to describe his greatest achievement, Zhang Qian reportedly said that he had learned to see the world as much larger than anyone had imagined. A world filled with peoples who shared the same fundamental desires for security, prosperity, and connection. In trying to find allies for war, Zhang Qian had discovered something far more valuable: the deeper human hunger for exchange, understanding, and mutual benefit that would sustain the Silk Road for more than 1,000 years to come. His accidental education and the realities of the wider world had revealed possibilities that no amount of court scholarship could have anticipated. By learning to see beyond the boundaries of his own culture, he had helped to create bridges that would connect civilizations and transform the course of human history. The marketplace in Bactria, where Zhang Qian had first glimpsed Chinese silk in foreign hands, would be remembered as the birthplace of a new kind of human relationship, one based on mutual benefit rather than conquest, on cultural exchange rather than cultural supremacy, on the recognition that the world's diversity was a source of wealth rather than a problem to be solved through force. The young general who had left Chang'an with a narrow mission of finding military allies had returned with something infinitely more valuable: a vision of how different peoples could enrich each other's lives through peaceful cooperation and exchange. This vision would outlive empires, survive wars and disasters, and continue to inspire new forms of human connection across the centuries that followed.